supposed to be in our woods.
In November 2020, veteran hunter Thaddeus Ravenclaw was tracking elk in the remote Blackmore Mountains when he witnessed something that revealed the horrifying truth about decades of missing hunters in the region. On his third day hunting, approximately 8 miles from base camp, Thaddeus noticed the forest had become unnaturally quiet. Against his better judgment, Thaddeus investigated, positioning himself behind a fallen log on a ridge overlooking a small valley. Through his rifle scope, Thaddeus saw another hunter moving through the forest below. Everything appeared normal, but Thaddeus could see what the hunter couldn't: something massive stalking him from the tree line. The creature moved with fluid grace between the shadows, standing at least 11 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they filled spaces between trees. It demonstrated predatory precision that spoke to years of experience hunting human prey, matching the hunter's pace exactly, studying patterns, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The stalking was methodical and calculated. The creature matched the hunter's pace exactly, maintaining consistent distance. When the hunter paused, it paused. When he changed direction, it adjusted accordingly. This wasn't animal behavior. This was calculated predation by an intelligence that understood human psychology and behavior patterns with terrifying sophistication. The creature studied its prey with the patience of a master predator, learning patterns and waiting for the optimal moment to strike. It moved ahead of the hunter, positioning itself to observe from multiple angles. It wasn't just following, it was herding, subtly influencing the hunter's path toward some predetermined kill zone where the attack would be most effective. Most disturbing was the creature's obvious tactical intelligence. It considered wind direction, terrain advantages, escape routes, and optimal attack positions with military-level strategic planning. This suggested extensive practice on human subjects, refining its methods through systematic predation conducted over many years of hunting human beings in these remote mountains. The creature's size alone was terrifying. Through his scope, Thaddeus could see that it stood at least 11 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the spaces between trees. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging down past its knees and ending in hands that appeared capable of crushing human bones like twigs. The creature's entire physiology seemed designed for violence, every aspect of its anatomy optimized for the systematic destruction of human life. At 2:15 p.m., the attack began. The hunter had stopped in a clearing to examine tracks when the creature emerged from the tree line with explosive speed that defied its massive size. Thaddeus got his first clear view of the attacker, a bipedal nightmare covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The creature's face was a horrifying amalgamation of human and beast, with features that suggested intelligence but were twisted by malevolence and an insatiable hunger for violence. Its eyes burned with an awareness that was unmistakably conscious, calculating, and utterly without mercy. The intelligence behind those eyes was ancient and malevolent, focused entirely on causing maximum suffering to its human prey. The creature's mouth was filled with teeth that were designed not just for killing, but for the systematic dismantling of its victims while they were still alive. The teeth were arranged in rows like a shark's, but they were larger and more varied in shape, suggesting different functions for different types of tissue destruction. Some were designed for cutting, others for grinding, and still others for the precise extraction of specific anatomical components. The hunter had no time to react. The creature struck with tremendous force, sending him flying across the clearing like a child's toy. The impact was so violent that Thaddeus could hear the sound of breaking bones even from his position 300 yards away. The hunter's rifle was torn from his hands and thrown deep into the forest, leaving him completely defenseless against his attacker. Thaddeus found himself frozen in absolute terror. His body refused to respond to his mind's desperate commands to move, to run, to do anything. He could only watch in paralyzed horror as the nightmare unfolded before him. His hunting instincts, honed by decades of experience, screamed at him to flee, but his muscles had turned to stone, leaving him trapped in his own body as a helpless witness to unspeakable horror. The creature didn't kill immediately. Instead, it began systematic assault that demonstrated both intelligence and sadistic pleasure in causing suffering. The creature grabbed the hunter by his legs and began swinging him against nearby trees, using the man's body as a weapon against the forest itself. Each impact was calculated to cause maximum damage while keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. The sounds that emerged from the clearing were unlike anything Thaddeus had ever heard. The hunter's screams were not just expressions of pain, they were sounds of absolute terror, the vocalizations of someone who had realized that death would not come quickly or mercifully. The screams echoed across the valley, creating haunting sounds that seemed to energize the creature and drive it to greater heights of violence. Thaddeus watched, unable to move, unable to look away, as the creature's face showed obvious pleasure at the sounds of breaking bones and agonized screams. It would pause between impacts, tilting its massive head as if listening to the hunter's screams with the appreciation of a connoisseur. The creature seemed to be savoring the sounds of suffering, taking time to appreciate the fear in its victim's eyes before continuing the systematic destruction of his body. The systematic nature was most disturbing. The creature wasn't acting on instinct or hunger. It was deliberately prolonging suffering, taking obvious pleasure in terror and pain. Each impact was calculated to cause maximum damage while keeping the victim conscious as long as possible. This was not random violence. It was systematic torture conducted by an intelligence that understood exactly what it was doing. After several minutes of this brutal assault, the creature changed tactics. It threw the hunter to the ground and began systematically breaking bones with its massive hands, starting with the man's fingers and working its way up his arms. The creature's movements were deliberate and methodical, suggesting extensive experience with this type of torture. Thaddeus's hands shook violently as he tried to process what he was witnessing, but his body remained frozen in place. The creature's hands were perfectly adapted for this work. Its fingers ended in claws that were sharp enough to pierce flesh, but controlled enough to avoid causing immediate death. The creature demonstrated surgical precision in its torture, breaking bones in specific sequences that would maximize pain while preventing shock or unconsciousness. The creature's hands were perfectly designed for systematic torture. Each finger was tipped with a claw that could be used with surgical precision, capable of making cuts that would cause maximum pain without causing fatal blood loss. The creature's grip strength was tremendous, allowing it to apply exactly the right amount of pressure to break bones without crushing them completely. The hunter's screams grew weaker as shock and blood loss began to take their toll, but the creature seemed to understand exactly how to keep its victim conscious and aware of what was happening. It would pause periodically, allowing the hunter to recover slightly before continuing its systematic destruction of his body. During these pauses, the creature would examine its work with obvious satisfaction, flexing the broken limbs and testing the damage it had caused. The creature took particular pleasure in the unnatural angles at which the bones now bent. It would manipulate the broken limbs, creating new configurations of damage and studying the hunter's reactions to different types of pain. The creature was not just torturing its victim, it was conducting experiments, learning about human anatomy and pain tolerance through direct observation and systematic experimentation. Thaddeus watched in paralyzed horror as the creature demonstrated knowledge of human anatomy that would be impressive in a medical professional, but was terrifying in a predator. The creature knew exactly which bones to break first, which nerve centers to target, which cuts would cause maximum pain without fatal blood loss. The level of anatomical expertise was disturbing in its implications. The torture continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 to 40 minutes. The creature had developed specific techniques for different types of torture, breaking bones in particular sequences, positioning the victim to maximize both pain and consciousness duration. The level of refinement suggested years of practice on human subjects, perfecting methods through extensive experimentation. The creature's methods were varied and sophisticated. It would twist limbs until joints dislocated, apply pressure to nerve centers to create waves of agony, and use its claws to make precise cuts that would cause maximum pain without causing fatal blood loss. The creature demonstrated knowledge of human anatomy that suggested it had been studying human physiology through direct experimentation for many years. Throughout this prolonged torture, Thaddeus remained frozen in his hiding spot, his mind screaming at his body to move, to help, to do something, but his muscles refused to respond. He was trapped in his own paralyzed body, forced to witness every horrific detail of the systematic destruction taking place below. His rifle lay useless in his hands, too far away to be effective even if he could overcome his paralysis. The creature seemed to understand exactly how much damage it could inflict without causing immediate death. It knew which bones to break first, which nerve centers to target, which cuts would cause maximum pain without fatal blood loss. The level of expertise was terrifying in its implications, suggesting that this creature had been perfecting its torture methods through extensive practice on human victims. The creature began experimenting with different torture methods, testing the hunter's responses to various types of trauma. It would apply pressure to specific points on the body, watching with clinical interest as the victim's reactions provided data about human pain thresholds and anatomical vulnerabilities. The systematic nature of this experimentation was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what Thaddeus witnessed. The creature wasn't simply causing pain, it was conducting research, gathering information about human physiology through direct observation and experimentation on a living subject. The creature would create specific types of injuries, then pause to study the effects, taking mental notes about which methods produced the most interesting results. The creature demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond instinctive predation. It understood human anatomy with the precision of a surgeon, knowing exactly which injuries would cause specific types of pain, which damage would be temporary versus permanent, and how to maintain consciousness despite extreme trauma. This level of knowledge could only have been acquired through extensive practice on human subjects. As the torture continued, the creature began to vary its methods, testing different approaches to see which produced the most interesting results. It would break bones in new patterns, apply pressure to different nerve clusters, and create injuries that interacted with each other to produce compound effects. The hunter's body became a canvas for the creature's experimentation. The creature's approach to torture was methodical and scientific, suggesting that it had been refining its techniques through extensive practice on human subjects over many years. Each movement was purposeful, each injury carefully calculated to provide specific information about human physiology and pain tolerance. The creature was building a comprehensive understanding of human suffering through systematic torture. Thaddeus watched in horror as the creature began to focus on specific anatomical systems, testing the limits of human endurance in different areas of the body. It would spend long minutes working on individual limbs, studying the effects of different types of damage with the dedication of a researcher conducting important experiments. The creature's torture techniques were sophisticated and refined. It knew how to break bones in ways that would cause maximum pain, how to dislocate joints to create specific types of agony, and how to use its claws to make cuts that would interact with broken bones to produce compound pain effects. The level of sophistication suggested years of practice and refinement. The creature seemed to take particular interest in the hunter's reactions to different types of pain. It would pause after each new injury to study the victim's face, watching for specific responses that would provide information about the effectiveness of different torture methods. The creature was learning, gathering data that would make it even more effective in future attacks. The systematic nature of the experimentation was terrifying in its implications. The creature wasn't just torturing for pleasure, it was conducting research that would improve its methods and make future attacks even more horrific. Each victim was providing data that would be used to refine the creature's techniques and make subsequent tortures more effective. After an eternity of systematic torture and experimentation, the creature began the final phase of its attack. It grabbed the hunter's head in its massive hands and began applying pressure, slowly crushing the skull while the victim remained alive and aware. The hunter's final screams were cut short as his skull collapsed under the tremendous force applied by the creature's powerful hands. The skull-crushing sound was audible even at Thaddeus's distance, a wet, grinding noise that spoke of tremendous pressure being applied to bone and brain tissue. The creature held the crushed skull for several moments, seeming to savor the moment of death before finally releasing its grip. The creature's face showed an expression of satisfaction and completion, as if it had achieved some important goal. But the horror wasn't over. The creature began a grotesque post-mortem ritual that revealed the true fate of all the missing hunters. The creature systematically dismantled the body, breaking bones and tearing flesh with methodical precision. It consumed some parts immediately, gnawing on bones to extract marrow while the blood was still fresh, creating sounds that echoed across the valley. The feeding behavior was not random or instinctive. The creature selected specific parts of the body, consuming them in a particular order that suggested ritual significance. It would pause between feeding to examine the remaining corpse, as if planning the next phase of its consumption according to some predetermined protocol that had been developed through years of practice. Thaddeus watched in paralyzed revulsion as the creature demonstrated anatomical knowledge that went far beyond simple predation. It knew which organs to consume first, which bones contained the most marrow, which parts of the body would provide the most nutritional value. The creature's feeding was efficient and systematic, suggesting that it had developed these techniques through extensive practice on human victims. The creature's feeding was accompanied by sounds that Thaddeus would never forget: the crack of bones being broken, the wet tearing of flesh, and a low rumbling that might have been the creature's expression of satisfaction. The sounds carried across the valley, creating an audio landscape that belonged in the deepest circles of hell rather than any earthly forest. The most disturbing aspect of this post-mortem ritual was the creature's obvious pleasure in its work. It would pause periodically to examine its handiwork, seeming to take satisfaction in the destruction it had caused. This wasn't simple feeding behavior. It was a celebration of violence conducted by an intelligence that understood exactly what it was doing and took pride in its achievements. The creature gathered the remaining bones and body parts, loading them into a crude sack made from animal hide. The creature was collecting trophies, taking parts of its victim back to some unknown location where they would join the remains of all the other missing hunters. The sack itself was disturbing in its implications, clearly handmade and stitched together with what appeared to be sinew or dried intestines. The creature had crafted tools for its hunting activities, suggesting a level of intelligence and planning that went far beyond simple animal behavior. The sack was not the only tool the creature possessed. Thaddeus could see other implements hanging from its belt, crude but effective devices that had been designed for specific aspects of hunting and processing human prey. Then came the methodical evidence elimination. The creature systematically eliminated all evidence of what had occurred. It scattered the hunter's gear across a wide area, buried some items, and threw others into dense undergrowth where they would never be found. The creature understood the importance of concealing its activities, suggesting intelligence that went far beyond simple animal cunning. Most disturbing of all was the creature's methodical approach to evidence elimination. It used branches to obscure bloodstains on the ground, moved rocks to cover disturbed earth, and even rearranged vegetation to make the clearing appear undisturbed. The creature understood human search methods and was taking specific steps to ensure that no evidence of its activities would be discovered. The creature's knowledge of human behavior was extensive and terrifying. It knew how search teams operated, what they looked for, and how to eliminate the specific types of evidence that would lead to discovery. This suggested that the creature had been observing human activities for years, learning their methods and developing countermeasures that would allow it to continue its predation without detection. Within 2 hours of the attack, the clearing showed no obvious signs of what had transpired. The creature had removed the body, scattered the evidence, and transformed the scene of brutal murder into what appeared to be an ordinary forest clearing. Any search team that investigated the area would find nothing to indicate what had happened to the missing hunter. As the creature finished its work, it slowly turned and looked directly toward Thaddeus's hiding spot. For a terrifying moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met across the distance. The creature's gaze held unmistakable intelligence, aware, calculating, and utterly without mercy. In that moment of eye contact, Thaddeus realized with absolute certainty that the creature had been aware of his presence throughout the entire attack. It had allowed him to witness its work, perhaps even performed for his benefit, demonstrating its methods and capabilities to someone who would carry the knowledge of its existence back to the human world. The creature's eyes seemed to bore into his soul, evaluating him with the same clinical detachment it had shown while torturing its victim. Thaddeus could see the intelligence behind those eyes, making a decision about whether to add him to its collection or allow him to escape with the knowledge of what he had witnessed. That moment of recognition broke Thaddeus's paralysis like a gunshot. Pure, primal terror flooded his system, overriding the shock that had kept him frozen for the past 2 hours. His body finally responded to his mind's desperate commands, and he exploded from his hiding spot in blind panic, crashing through the undergrowth without regard for stealth or safety. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at his clothes and skin as he fled in absolute terror. Behind him, he could hear the creature's roar of rage, a sound that seemed to shake the very mountains, and spoke of fury at having its prey escape. The sound was unlike anything in nature, a vocalization that combined animal rage with intelligent frustration. The sound of massive footsteps thundered behind him, each impact seeming to shake the ground beneath his feet. The creature was pursuing him with the same methodical precision it had shown in its attack. But now there was urgency in its movements, anger at being denied another victim for its collection of human trophies. Thaddeus ran with superhuman speed, born of pure terror, crashing through dense forest without regard for the branches that tore at his flesh or the rocks that bruised his feet. He could hear the creature behind him, its breathing like a steam engine, its footsteps getting closer with each passing second. The creature's pursuit was relentless and methodical. As he crashed through a particularly dense thicket, Thaddeus caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run even colder. Through the trees to his left, another massive form was moving parallel to his path. At first, he thought it might be another tree or a large boulder, but as his terror-sharpened vision focused, he realized with absolute horror that it was another creature. This second creature was similar in size and build to his pursuer, but it wasn't participating in the chase. Instead, it was simply watching, moving through the forest with the same fluid grace, but maintaining a consistent distance. The creature's posture suggested casual observation rather than active hunting, as if it were merely a spectator to the deadly game unfolding in the forest. The realization that there were multiple creatures in these mountains hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. This wasn't an isolated predator. This was evidence of a population, a community of these nightmarish beings that had been systematically hunting human beings in the remote wilderness areas. The implications were staggering and terrifying beyond comprehension. The watching creature's behavior suggested a social structure among these beings. It wasn't interfering with the hunt, respecting what appeared to be territorial boundaries or hunting protocols. The creature seemed content to observe, perhaps learning from the techniques being employed by its companion, or simply enjoying the spectacle of human terror and desperation. As Thaddeus continued his desperate flight, he could see the watching creature keeping pace through the trees, its massive form moving with the same silent efficiency that characterized these beings. The creature's eyes were visible even at distance, burning with the same intelligent malevolence that had characterized his pursuer. But there was also something that might have been amusement in its gaze. The presence of the second creature added a new dimension of terror to Thaddeus's flight. Not only was he being hunted by one of these nightmarish beings, but he was also being observed by another, as if his desperate attempt to escape was providing entertainment for these ancient predators. The psychological impact of being watched while fleeing for his life was almost as terrifying as the physical pursuit itself. The watching creature's behavior suggested that these beings had developed complex social behaviors around their predation of human beings. There were apparently rules and protocols governing their hunts, territorial boundaries that were respected, and perhaps even hierarchies that determined which creature had the right to pursue specific prey. The pursuit seemed to last forever, though it was probably only minutes. Thaddeus's lungs burned, his legs screamed in agony, but the terror of what was behind him and what was watching from the side drove him forward beyond the limits of human endurance. He could feel both creatures' presence like physical weights, pressing against his consciousness and filling him with the absolute certainty that he was completely outmatched. Just when he thought the pursuing creature would catch him, when he could almost feel those claws tearing into his back, Thaddeus burst through a line of trees and found himself at the edge of a deep, fast-flowing river. The water was dark and cold, rushing between steep banks with a current that spoke of dangerous depths and hidden obstacles. Without hesitation, driven by pure survival instinct and the absolute certainty that the water offered his only chance of escape, Thaddeus launched himself into the churning water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and shocking his system. The current immediately grabbed him, pulling him downstream with tremendous force that threatened to dash him against the rocks. As he struggled to keep his head above water, fighting against the current that threatened to drag him under and drown him, Thaddeus looked back toward the riverbank. Both creatures now stood at the water's edge, their massive forms silhouetted against the darkening sky like primordial nightmares given physical form. The pursuing creature's eyes burned with frustrated rage, but neither creature made any attempt to enter the river. Whether they couldn't swim or simply chose not to pursue him into the water, Thaddeus would never know. But their reluctance to follow gave him hope for the first time since the nightmare began. Both creatures watched him with those calculating eyes as the current carried him downstream, their gazes never wavering even as the distance between them increased. There was something almost respectful in their observation, as if they acknowledged that their prey had earned its escape through courage and quick thinking rather than mere luck. The watching creature seemed to communicate something to the pursuer, though Thaddeus couldn't hear any sounds over the rushing water. The interaction between the two beings suggested a level of communication and social organization that was terrifying in its implications for human safety in these remote wilderness areas. Thaddeus fought against the current, using every ounce of his remaining strength to swim toward the opposite bank. The water was brutally cold, sapping his energy and threatening to drag him under with each passing moment. Several times he went under, swallowing mouthfuls of river water, but somehow he managed to keep fighting against the current that wanted to claim his life. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Thaddeus finally managed to grab hold of a fallen tree branch extending into the water from the opposite bank. Using the last of his strength, he hauled himself out of the river and collapsed on the muddy shore, gasping and shivering uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. He lay there for a long time, too exhausted to move, too traumatized to think clearly about what he had witnessed. When he finally gathered the strength to look back across the river, both creatures were gone, vanished into the forest as silently as they had appeared, leaving no trace of their presence except for the horrific memories burned into Thaddeus's mind. Thaddeus spent the night huddled against a tree, too terrified to sleep, jumping at every sound the forest made around him. When dawn broke, he began walking downstream, following the river toward civilization. He was found 24 hours later by a search and rescue team, hypothermic, dehydrated, and in a state of severe psychological shock. The rescuers found him sitting by the riverbank, staring across the water with vacant eyes, muttering incoherently about multiple creatures in the forest. He was immediately airlifted to the nearest hospital, where doctors treated him for exposure and exhaustion, but the physical injuries were nothing compared to the psychological trauma. Thaddeus was no longer the confident, experienced hunter who had entered the mountains 3 days earlier. He had become something else, a broken man haunted by knowledge too terrible to share. His claims about multiple creatures were dismissed as hallucinations brought on by exposure and trauma.